A camera lay inside a tree hollow for 20 years, 2 meters from a hiking trail walked by thousands of tourists. The waterproof case showed no damage. The battery was dead, but the memory card worked perfectly when Spanish tourist Javier Castillo connected it to his laptop in February 2024. The last photograph captured a sunset over a valley blanketed with orange wings, millions of monarch butterflies clustered on every branch. Beautiful, except for one detail in the lower right corner, a human finger, blurred, as if someone had pressed the shutter button while running. The metadata showed the date, January 14, 2004, 5:43 p.m. The timestamp raised an immediate question. Why would anyone hide a camera in a tree hollow instead of taking it home? Before we begin the story, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We're really curious where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a rating. Javier Castillo adjusted his glasses on the bridge of his nose. A habit. He did it constantly, even when the frames sat perfectly in place. He had been photographing an owl's nest in the Sierra Chincua Biosphere Reserve in Michoacán, Mexico, when he spotted the black bag wedged deep inside the ancient fir tree's hollow. The bag's zipper still worked smoothly. Inside, wrapped in a sealed plastic layer, sat a Nikon D70 professional camera. Javier pulled out the microfiber cloth he kept in his photographer's vest and wiped his lens before examining the find more carefully. The camera body showed minimal wear. Someone had protected it deliberately. He brought the camera to the small ranger station near the reserve entrance. The officer on duty made 3 phone calls before the matter reached Inspector Ricardo Solis in the Cold Case Division of the Michoacán State Police. Solis drove the 40 kilometers of winding mountain roads from the nearest city to the reserve. He carried a moleskin notebook, never used recording devices. As he examined the camera, he rolled a 1985 peso coin between his fingers, a silver talisman from his late mentor. The habit surfaced whenever he encountered something unexplainable. Solis opened his notebook and wrote the date, February 18, 2024. Then he scrolled through the camera's memory card on the ranger station computer. Most photographs showed routine documentation: monarch butterflies in their winter migration, close-ups of wing patterns, wide shots of the forest canopy, professional work. Then came the final 14 images. The composition changed. The angles became hurried, less artistic, more documentary. The subjects shifted from butterflies to something else entirely. Trees with fresh cut marks, a clearing that should not exist in a protected reserve, machinery, chainsaws lying on tarps, trucks partially visible through gaps in the forest, and people, 7 men in work clothes, their faces captured in varying degrees of clarity as the photographer apparently tried to document the scene without being noticed. The final image showed that sunset, the blurred finger, then nothing more. Solis wrote slowly in his notebook, weighing each observation. The GPS metadata embedded in the photographs provided coordinates. He cross-referenced them with reserve maps. The location fell deep inside a protected zone where logging had been strictly prohibited since 1986. He returned to the archive search function on his laptop and entered parameters. Missing persons, January 2004, Sierra Chincua area. 2 names appeared. Mateo Valdez, age 34, biologist from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, specialized in lepidopter and migration patterns. Isabella Navarro, age 29, documentary photographer and ecologist, freelance work for environmental organizations. The official report filed in March 2004 stated that both researchers had become lost in the mountainous terrain during their documentation trip. Search teams had combed the area for 3 months. No bodies recovered. The prevailing theory suggested hypothermia. Night temperatures in the high-altitude forest regularly dropped to -5 Celsius, easy to lose the trail in fog, easy to become disoriented. The case closed with a presumed death ruling. But the camera told a different story. Someone had hidden it intentionally, placed it high enough that casual animals would not disturb it, low enough that a human might eventually find it. The waterproof case suggested planning. This was not dropped accidentally. Solis flipped back through the original case file. Mateo Valdez had been reported missing by the university on January 18, 2004, when he failed to return from the field research trip. The initial investigation noted that both researchers had checked into a small guest house in the village of San Felipe on January 11. They hired a local guide, a man named Benito Hernandez, 52 years old, who worked as a reserve ranger and occasionally guided researchers through the more remote areas. According to Hernandez's statement from January 2004, he had accompanied Mateo and Isabella to their research site on January 12th. He helped them set up base camp near a stream approximately 6 kilometers from the main trail. He left them there with enough supplies for 5 days. The arrangement was that they would hike back to the village independently. Both were experienced outdoors people. The route was marked, but they never returned. Solis noted something in the margin of his notebook. Benito Hernandez, last person to see them alive. He underlined the name twice. The inspector drove to San Felipe the following morning. The village clung to the mountainside like moss on stone. 200 permanent residents. Most made their living from the seasonal tourism that came to witness the monarch migration between November and March. The guest house where Mateo and Isabella had stayed still operated under the same family ownership. The proprietor remembered them vaguely. The woman who ran the place said many researchers passed through. She recalled that the two seemed professional, focused on their work. They kept to themselves mostly. Benito Hernandez lived in a small house on the village outskirts. Paint peeled from the wooden siding. A truck from the late 1990s sat in the dirt driveway, showing rust but still functional. Solis knocked on the door. A dog barked inside. The man who answered stood slightly bent, as if his spine had begun curving with age. He was 69 now. His hands looked rough, the knuckles enlarged. He cracked those knuckles before speaking, a nervous habit. The inspector introduced himself and explained about the camera. Benito Hernandez's left eye squinted slightly. Just a small tells when uncomfortable questions arose. He invited Solis inside anyway. The house interior was neat but sparse. A wood stove in the corner. Photographs on one wall showing family gatherings. Benito wore a worn leather jacket even indoors. A patch covered the left elbow where the original leather had worn through. Benito confirmed his previous statement. Yes, he had guided the two researchers. Yes, he had left them at the campsite. Yes, he had thought it strange when they never returned. He had even joined the search parties. He gestured to his bad leg, an old injury. Made hiking difficult now, but back then he had covered many kilometers looking for signs of them. Solis showed him printouts of the photographs from the camera, the images of the logging site. Benito studied them for a long moment. He cracked his knuckles again. That squint deepened. He said he recognized the area, said illegal logging had been a problem in the reserve for years, still was if truth be told. The rangers tried to patrol, but the forest was vast. Organized groups would move in quickly, cut what they wanted, and vanish before authorities could respond. The inspector asked if Benito had seen any logging activity during that January in 2004. The ranger shook his head. He had been focused on the search for the missing researchers. Had not noticed anything unusual in terms of logging, but then again, he added after a pause, he might not have been looking for that specifically. Solis made notes. He asked about Benito's financial situation in 2004 and 2005. The question seemed to catch the guide off guard. The squint became more pronounced. Benito said he had been struggling back then. Work was irregular. Then, in 2005, he had sold some family land to a cousin. That gave him enough to buy the truck outside. He needed it for work. Why did that matter? The inspector did not answer directly. He thanked Benito for his time and left his card. As he walked back to his vehicle, he noted the truck again, a 2005 model. He had checked land transaction records before driving to the village. There was indeed a sale registered in Benito Hernandez's name from March 2005, 85,000 pesos for a small plot on the village edge. The buyer was listed as a cousin, Ernesto Hernandez. But when Solis had cross-referenced the name, Ernesto Hernandez had died in 1998, 7 years before the supposed transaction. Back in his office, Solis scrubbed the case file across his desk, the photographs from the camera. The original missing persons report, financial records he had requested. A pattern formed, but with gaps. Gaps that created questions rather than answers. The university archive provided Mateo Valdez's field journal from previous expeditions. The pages showed meticulous documentation, weather conditions, butterfly counts, GPS coordinates, sketches of wing patterns. The entries were scientific and dry until the final pages from the January 2004 trip. The handwriting became less steady. The entry from January 14 read, "Isabella photographed something important. We decided to stay 2 more days. Benito seems nervous. He advised us to leave. He says the mountains are restless." That phrasing stuck with Solis. The mountains are restless. An odd way to express concern. Politic, almost. Not the language of simple weather warnings. He turned to Isabella Navarro's background. She had worked on several environmental documentation projects before 2004. Her portfolio included photographs of deforestation in Chiapas, illegal fishing operations in Baja California, and pollution in industrial zones near Mexico City. Her work had appeared in environmental magazines and been used in legal cases against polluters. She knew how to document evidence. She understood the value of visual proof. The silver coin rotated between Solis's fingers as he considered the scenario. 2 experienced researchers encounter illegal logging in a protected area. They document it. They recognize the danger. Instead of leaving immediately, they stay to gather more evidence. Or perhaps they tried to leave but could not. Either way, the camera ends up hidden in a tree hollow. A deliberate act. A message in a bottle, essentially, hoping someone would eventually find it. But why had no one investigated the logging operation at the time? Solis checked the 2004 police reports from the region. Nothing about illegal logging in the Sierra Chinqua Reserve during January. No arrests, no seizures of equipment. The search for the missing researchers had consumed all attention. Once that search concluded unsuccessfully, the case file gathered dust. The inspector requested enhanced analysis of the photographs. A specialist in digital forensics worked on improving the image quality, particularly the shots showing the men's faces. Modern software could sometimes extract surprising detail from older digital images. The resolution of the Nikon D70 was lower by contemporary standards, but the original files contained information that basic viewing might miss. While waiting for those results, Solis drove back to the reserve. He hired a different guide this time, a younger man who had grown up in the area. They hiked to the GPS coordinates from the photographs. The location required 4 hours of walking from the nearest trail access point. The path wound through dense forest, past streams running cold and clear from mountain snowmelt. The altitude made breathing harder. The air carried the scent of wet bark and pine resin. They found the site, or rather, what remained of it 20 years later. The forest had reclaimed most evidence, but certain signs persisted. Stumps from trees cut decades ago showed different weathering than natural deadfall. The growth patterns of newer trees revealed gaps where larger specimens had once stood. An old clearing, now filled with younger growth, still showed the compressed soil where heavy equipment had been parked. Solis photographed everything. He collected soil samples, though he doubted they would reveal much after 2 decades. He walked the perimeter of the clearing, trying to imagine what Mateo and Isabella had witnessed. The operation would have been loud. Chainsaws, trucks, men shouting instructions. Hard to approach without being noticed. Unless they had stumbled upon it accidentally. Perhaps they had been following butterfly clusters and emerged from the forest directly into the clearing. No time to retreat unseen. In that case, the workers would have seen them, would have recognized the camera, would have understood the threat. The inspector returned to the tree where Javier Castile had found the camera. The hollow sat approximately 2 meters above ground level, accessible by climbing, but not obvious to someone simply walking past. Isabella must have scrambled up quickly, shoved the camera inside, and hoped. Perhaps she had time to seal it in the waterproof bag. Perhaps that had already been part of her field kit. Then what? Had she and Mateo run? Had they tried to talk their way out of the situation? No way to know. Not yet. The forensic analysis came back 3 weeks later. The specialist had used AI-enhanced resolution techniques on the photographs of the men in the clearing. 6 faces achieved sufficient clarity for potential identification. The 7th man appeared only from behind or at angles that obscured his features. But one image, frame number 187 from the camera's memory, showed something interesting. A man in the middle distance unloading a chainsaw from a truck bed. He wore a checked flannel shirt. His right hand was visible. On that hand, catching a glint of afternoon sun, was a ring, a substantial ring. The enhancement algorithm had improved the detail enough to see that the ring bore some kind of engraving or initial. Solis studied the image until his eyes hurt. The man's face was 3/4 turned away. The AI reconstruction suggested possibilities but could not provide certainty. However, the ring, that was concrete, a physical object, traceable, potentially. He began checking records of local residents in 2004. Who had worked in logging, legal or otherwise? Who had owned sawmills or lumber yards? The lists were longer than he had hoped. Michoacan's economy depended heavily on timber before stricter regulations took hold.
Many men had worked in the industry. Then a detail from Benito Hernandez's interview returned to him. The ranger had mentioned that illegal operations were organized, not random individuals cutting firewood. Organized meant hierarchy, meant someone in charge, someone with resources, someone with enough influence to avoid attention from authorities. Solis pulled records on logging prosecutions in the region from 2003 to 2006. Very few. Only 2 cases had gone to trial. Both resulted in small fines, no jail time. The defendants in those cases had been laborers, not organizers. The actual owners of the operations had never been identified. Or rather, he corrected himself, they had never been charged. One name kept appearing in tangential documents, Osvaldo Ramirez. In 2004, according to tax records, Osvaldo had worked as a foreman for a mid-sized lumber company that operated in neighboring regions. Nothing illegal on record. But in 2006, Osvaldo had purchased his own sawmill. By 2010, he owned 3. Now, in 2024, Osvaldo Ramirez controlled the largest timber operation in the region, all operating with proper permits and legal contracts. A success story.
From foreman to businessman in 2 decades. The inspector looked up Osvaldo's current address. The man lived in a substantial house on the edge of the city. Married, 2 grown children. Member of the municipal council. Respected, wealthy. He was 64 years old now. Would have been 47 in 2004. Solis scheduled an interview under the pretense of routine questions about historical logging practices. Nothing threatening, just gathering background for a case review. Osvaldo agreed readily. He met the inspector at his sawmill office. The building smelled of fresh-cut cedar and machine oil. Everything was organized, clean, professional. Osvaldo Ramirez wore a pressed shirt. The fabric looked expensive. The man carried himself with confidence that came from success. When he shook Solis's hand, the inspector noticed a gold ring on Osvaldo's right hand. Heavy, engraved. The inspector could make out an initial, the letter R. They spoke for 30 minutes. Osvaldo confirmed he had worked in the industry since his 20s. His father before him had been a logger, family tradition. He expressed appropriate concern when Solis mentioned the missing researchers from 2004. Terrible tragedy. He had heard about it at the time, but he had been working in a different area of the state back then. His crew had been clearing land for a new road near Unawapan, 60 kilometers away. He still had the employment records if needed. Solis thanked him and left. He sat in his car in the sawmill parking lot and wrote in his notebook. The ring was similar, but many men wore rings. That proved nothing. The location alibi could be checked, though. 20 years made verification difficult. Still, something felt wrong. Osvaldo had been too smooth, too helpful, too prepared with his explanations. The inspector returned to the archives and pulled every document connected to Osvaldo's business growth. The sawmill purchase in 2006 had cost 200,000 pesos. The bank loan that financed it showed Osvaldo had provided a down payment of 80,000 pesos cash. The loan officer's notes indicated the money came from savings and family assistance. No specific documentation of the source. 80,000 pesos in cash in 2006, similar to the 85,000 pesos Benito Hernandez had supposedly received from selling land to a dead cousin in 2005. Similar amounts, similar timing, perhaps just coincidence. Solis pulled the photographs from the camera again. He focused on the image with the ring. He compared it to photographs of Osvaldo Ramirez from various sources: business magazine profiles, municipal council meetings, publicity photos from charity events. In every image where Osvaldo's right hand was visible, he wore that same distinctive ring. But the face in the camera photograph remained frustratingly uncleared. The angle was wrong, the resolution insufficient. Without a definitive facial match, the ring alone would never stand as evidence, circumstantial at best. The inspector spent another week tracking down men who had worked in logging around Sierra Chinqua in the early 2000s. Most conversations led nowhere. People had moved, memories had faded. Some refused to talk at all. The timber industry had a culture of silence regarding the illegal operations. Everyone knew they happened. Few would testify about them. Then he found Miguel Torres, a retired logger living in a nursing home in Morelia. Miguel was 73 years old and suffering from emphysema. A lifetime of chainsaw exhaust and cigarette smoke had destroyed his lungs. He could barely walk from his room to the common area. But his mind remained clear. When Solis showed him the enhanced photographs from the camera, Miguel studied them for a long time. Then he pointed to two of the faces. Those men had worked for the same contractor he had in the late 1990s and early 2000s. One was named Raul something. The other called himself Chavo. Miguel could not remember last names. Both men were dead now anyway. Raul had died in a car accident in 2007. Chavo had fallen from construction scaffolding in 2009. Miguel pointed to another face in the photograph. That one looked familiar too, but he could not place the name. Maybe someone from the crews that worked the Sierra Chinqua area. But Miguel had never personally worked that territory. Too remote. He had stuck to sites with better road access. The inspector thanked him and prepared to leave. Then Miguel asked if he could see the photographs once more. Solis handed them over. The old loggers studied them in silence. Then he tapped one image, the man with the ring. Miguel said that checked shirt looked familiar. He thought he might have seen someone wearing a similar pattern at a union meeting around 2004, but he could not be certain. Old eyes, old memories. Everything blended together now. Solis drove back to his office. He had collected fragments, but no complete picture. Benito Hernandez, nervous and financially questionable. Osvaldo Ramirez, successful, but with murky origins to his wealth. Dead men who had worked illegal logging jobs, a camera hidden in a tree, two missing researchers who had never been found. He opened his notebook to a fresh page and wrote one question. Why had no one investigated the logging site in 2004? The answer came after digging through administrative records. The police commander responsible for the region in January 2004 was Enrique Salazar. Salazar found Salazar's name attached to multiple land deals in the years following 2004. Salazar had retired in 2012 with a pension and purchased a ranch in Colima, a property worth several million pesos, far more than a police commander's salary should have allowed, even with decades of savings. Salazar had died in 2019, heart attack, but his financial records still existed. Solis obtained them through official channels. Among the deposits in Salazar's accounts from 2004 through 2006 were multiple cash transactions, 50,000 here, 30,000 there, all marked as private sale of personal property or similar vague descriptions. The amounts totaled over 300,000 pesos across those years. Protection money, most likely. Payments to ensure certain operations went unnoticed. Payments to ensure evidence disappeared or investigations stalled. The pieces began forming a structure, an organized logging operation in early 2004, two researchers who documented it, a corrupt police commander who ensured no investigation followed, and someone who had benefited enough from the operation's success to build an empire over the following 20 years. But without bodies, without direct testimony, without that enhanced photograph providing absolute identification, the case remained circumstantial, frustratingly circumstantial. Solis sat at his desk as evening shadows filled his office. He rolled the peso coin between his fingers. His mentor used to say that cold cases required patience. Required waiting for the moment when the past could no longer stay buried. 20 years ago, someone had gotten away with something. Two people had vanished. Evidence had been suppressed. But now the camera had emerged.
like a seed that had waited in the soil, finally breaking through. The question was what would grow from it. The enhanced photographs spread across the conference table looked like ghosts captured in amber. 6 faces, varying degrees of clarity. 1 checked shirt with a ring. Inspector Solis had assembled a team of 3 junior investigators to help track down identities. They worked methodically through facial recognition databases, employment records, and death certificates. By March 2024, they had names for 5 of the 6 clear faces. Raul Mendoza died in a single vehicle accident, 2007. His truck had gone off a mountain road at night. No witnesses. Blood alcohol levels suggested intoxication. Salvador Chavo Herrera fell from construction scaffolding, 2009. Working alone on a Sunday when no one else was at the site. The safety harness had been improperly secured. Fernando Aguilar drowned in the Cupatizio River, 2011. Strong swimmer according to family. Body found 3 kilometers downstream from where he had been fishing alone. Luis Morales, overdose of prescription painkillers, 2010. No prior history of drug abuse according to medical records. Carlos Delgado, house fire, 2008. Electrical fault determined as cause. He had been sleeping and never made it out of the bedroom. The 6th clear face belonged to Pedro Vasquez, still alive, age 58. Living in Guadalajara, working as a night security guard at a warehouse. When Solis called to arrange an interview, Pedro hung up immediately. The 2nd call went unanswered. The 3rd resulted in Pedro's wife answering. She said her husband wanted nothing to do with police. Old troubles, bad memories, leave them alone. Solis drove to Guadalajara personally. 8 hours through mountains and valleys. He found Pedro's apartment building in a working-class neighborhood. Concrete blocks painted pale yellow, laundry hanging from balconies. The sound of children playing in the courtyard. Pedro's wife answered the door. She looked tired. Her name was Carmen. She worked as a cleaner in an office building. Double shifts to make rent. The inspector explained he was investigating a cold case. No one was in trouble. He just needed information about events from 20 years ago. Carmen looked skeptical but let him wait in the living room while she called her husband at work. 20 minutes later, Pedro arrived. He walked with a slight limp. Old injury, he explained. His face showed deep lines. Stress aged people faster than years. Pedro sat across from Solis but kept his jacket on, as if ready to leave at any moment. His hands stayed folded in his lap. He had worked lumber jobs in Michoacán from 1999 to 2004, he confirmed. Cash work mostly, no contracts. He had left that life behind, moved to Guadalajara to start fresh. Married Carmen in 2006, had 2 daughters now, worked honest jobs, paid taxes, wanted no connection to the past. Solis showed him the photographs from the camera. Pedro's hands tightened. His breathing changed, shallow, quick. He recognized himself in one image, 20 years younger, but definitely him. He had been there that day in January 2004, the Sierra Chinqua job. He remembered it. The money had been good. Too good, really. That should have been a warning. The crew had been told they were clearing deadfall and diseased trees under an emergency forest management permit. Pedro had suspected otherwise, but needed the work. His first child had been on the way. He had taken any job offered. They had been cutting for 3 days when the 2 strangers appeared. A man and a woman with cameras and notebooks. They had emerged from the forest suddenly, probably following butterfly clusters. Everyone had frozen. The woman had raced her camera, taking pictures rapidly. Professional reflex, probably. The foreman had started shouting. Pedro could not remember exact words. Just anger, fear, the kind of tension that preceded violence. Pedro stopped talking. He looked at his hands. Carmen brought him water. He drank slowly, then continued. The foreman had made a call on his radio, someone higher up the chain. Pedro had not heard the conversation, but afterward the foreman had ordered everyone to load the trucks immediately. Leave the equipment, just get the vehicles out. They had driven down logging roads in a convoy, leaving dust clouds behind them. At the bottom of the mountain, they had been told to go home. They would be contacted about payment. Do not talk about the job. Do not talk about the strangers.
just forget everything. 2 days later, Pedro had received an envelope with his payment, double what had been promised, and a note. One line: "Silence is golden." He had understood the message. The extra money was not generosity, it was a purchase. His silence had been bought. Over the following years, Pedro had heard about the others dying, one by one. Accidents, bad luck, coincidences. He had started drinking heavily, could not sleep. Finally, his wife had given an ultimatum: leave Michoacan or lose his family. They had moved to Guadalajara in late 2004, changed their phone numbers, cut ties with everyone from the lumber crews, started over. Solis asked about the foreman, who had been in charge. Pedro shook his head. The foreman had been just middle management, following orders like everyone else. The real boss had never been on site. Pedro had heard a name mentioned once, Osvaldo something, but he had never met the man. Everything had gone through the foreman. What happened to the foreman? Dead. Car accident in 2005. Pedro had heard about it through a cousin. The foreman's name had been Alejandro Ruiz. His car had gone into a ravine during a rainstorm. The body had been burned beyond recognition, identified only through dental records. Pedro looked directly at Solis for the first time. 7 men from that crew were dead. Pedro was the only survivor. He had survived by running, by staying quiet, by becoming invisible. Now this camera had surfaced, and suddenly the past was reaching for him again. He had a family, daughters aged 16 and 14. They knew nothing about his former life. He wanted it to stay that way. The inspector promised to keep Pedro's name out of official reports as much as possible, but if the case went to trial, testimony might be needed. Pedro nodded. He understood. He would do what was necessary. Those 2 researchers deserved justice. Their families deserved answers. But he was scared. Even after 20 years, he was scared. Solis drove back to Michoacan with new information. Alejandro Ruiz, the foreman. Another death to add to the pattern. That made 8 deaths connected to the logging crew from January 2004. Only Pedro survived, and only because he had fled immediately. The pattern suggested systematic elimination of witnesses. But who had orchestrated it? Who had the resources and motivation to track down and eliminate 8 men over a 7-year period? Each death had been staged to look accidental or self-inflicted. That required planning, patience, professional skill, possibly. The inspector returned to Osvaldo Ramirez's background. In 2004, Osvaldo had been a foreman for a lumber company called Maderas del Sur. The company had dissolved in 2006. Its owner, Joaquin Espinosa, had retired to Spain. Solis tracked down Espinosa's contact information. The man was 81 years old, living in Valencia. The phone call required careful timing due to the time difference. Espinosa remembered Osvaldo Ramirez clearly. Smart, ambitious, sometimes too ambitious. Espinosa had suspected Osvaldo ran side operations using company equipment. Nothing proven, but inventory discrepancies had suggested unauthorized use. Espinosa had been planning to fire Osvaldo in early 2004, but then Osvaldo had come to him with a buyout offer for some of the company's older equipment. Cash deal, good price. Espinosa had been ready to retire anyway, so he had accepted. The deal had helped finance his move to Spain. How much cash? 200,000 pesos. Osvaldo had paid in installments over 6 months, all cash. Espinosa had not asked about the source, not his business. He had just wanted to retire in peace. Solis hung up and made notes. In 2004, Osvaldo had been a mid-level foreman. By 2005, he had enough cash to buy out his boss's equipment. By 2006, he owned his own sawmill. The timeline aligned with the illegal logging operation. The money had to come from somewhere. The inspector decided to pressure Benito Hernandez again. The old guide's story had holes. His financial records were suspicious. He might crack under proper interrogation. Solis drove to San Felipe village. But when he arrived at Benito's house, he found an ambulance in the driveway. Benito had suffered a heart attack that morning. The paramedics were preparing to transport him to the hospital in Morelia. At the hospital, Benito was stabilized but weak. His nephew, Roberto, stood by the bed. Roberto was 43, worked as a school teacher in the village. He looked exhausted. He had been his uncle's primary caregiver for the past 5 years as Benito's health declined. The old man had been under increasing stress lately, Roberto said, ever since the police visit started. He would sit at night drinking mezcal, muttering about the past, about things he should have done differently. Solis waited until Roberto stepped out for coffee, then sat beside Benito's bed. The old guide's eyes were open but unfocused. Medications and pain. Solis spoke softly. He said he knew Benito had been paid to lie in 2004. He knew about the land sale to the dead cousin. He knew Benito had been carrying this guilt for 20 years. Now was the time to clear his conscience. Benito's eyes focused. Tears formed. His voice came out as a whisper. They had threatened him, the men who came to his house 3 days after the researchers disappeared. They knew where his sister lived, where his nephews went to school. They offered money for his silence and cooperation. They told him what to say to the police, that he had left the researchers at their camp, that they had planned to return alone. Simple lies that could not be disproven. But Benito had not left them at the camp. He had been with them when they found the logging site. He had tried to warn them, told them to leave immediately. But Isabella had wanted photographs, evidence. She had said it was important. Mateo had supported her. They had spent 20 minutes documenting the scene while Benito grew increasingly panicked. Then the workers had spotted them. Benito had recognized some faces from the village, local men who did illegal cutting to supplement their income. The foreman, Alejandro Ruiz, had approached aggressively. Benito had tried to defuse the situation, explained that the researchers were just studying butterflies, no trouble intended. They would leave immediately. But Alejandro had seen the camera, had seen Isabella taking photographs. He had demanded the camera. Isabella had refused. She had started backing away, still shooting. Mateo had stepped between her and the workers. Alejandro had pulled out his radio, made a call. The response had been immediate. Do not let them leave. Benito had begged Alejandro to reconsider. These were university people. Their disappearance would trigger searches, investigations. Alejandro had said that was not his problem. Orders were orders. Benito had realized what was about to happen. He had told Mateo and Isabella to run, shouted at them. They had not understood at first. Then they had seen the workers spreading out, trying to surround them. They had run. Benito had not followed, could not. His leg, injured years before in a logging accident, would not allow him to run. He had stayed at the site while the workers pursued the researchers into the forest. He had heard shouting in the distance. Then, nothing. An hour later, Alejandro had returned alone. He had told Benito that the situation was handled. Benito would receive money for his cooperation. If he refused or talked, his family would suffer. Simple choice. Where had they taken the bodies? Benito did not know. Alejandro had not said. But there were old mining shafts throughout the mountains, vertical drops hundreds of feet deep, or they might have used lime to dissolve. Benito could not finish the sentence. The heart monitor beside his bed showed elevated stress. A nurse entered to check on him. Solis left the hospital with partial confirmation, but still no direct evidence linking Osvaldo Ramirez to the murders. Benito had never heard Osvaldo's name during the incident. Alejandro Ruiz had been the visible authority, and Alejandro was dead, unable to testify about who had given him orders. The investigation needed something more concrete. Solis returned to the enhanced photographs, the ring on the man's hand. If he could prove that ring belonged to Osvaldo, it would place him at the scene. But how to prove ownership of a ring from 20 years ago? He researched Osvaldo's family history. His father, Ruben Ramirez, had been a logger in the 1960s and 70s, had died in 1995. Solis found the obituary in newspaper archives. It mentioned that Ruben had been buried with full honors by the local logging union. There was a photograph from the funeral, black and white, grainy, but it showed Ruben in his casket. On his right hand, visible despite the poor image quality, was a large ring. Solis tracked down the funeral home that had handled the arrangements. They still had records. The funeral director, now in his 70s, remembered the Ramirez family. Yes, there had been a ring, a gold signet ring with the initial R engraved on it, a family heirloom, but Ruben had not been buried with it. The eldest son had requested it be removed before the casket was closed. The eldest son was Osvaldo.
Now, Solis had a connection. The ring in the photograph from 2004 matched the description of a ring that had belonged to Osvaldo's father, a ring that Osvaldo had specifically kept after his father's death. It was still circumstantial, but growing stronger. The inspector requested a warrant to search Osvaldo's properties. The judge hesitated. Osvaldo was a respected businessman, a municipal council member. The evidence was largely circumstantial, but the pattern of deaths among the logging crew was suspicious enough to warrant further investigation. The judge approved a limited search warrant for financial records and any items that might connect to the 2004 case. The search team arrived at Osvaldo's sawmill office on a Thursday morning in April 2024. Osvaldo's lawyer was present immediately. They reviewed the warrant carefully, challenging its scope, but the search proceeded. Financial records were seized, computers were imaged for analysis, and in a locked drawer in Osvaldo's desk, investigators found something unexpected, a small wooden box.
Inside, wrapped in cloth, were personal items, military medals from Osvaldo's grandfather, old photographs, a pocket watch, and at the bottom, a leather folder. Inside the folder were driver's licenses, 3 of them, Mateo Valdez, Isabela Navarro, and Benito Hernandez. Benito's license was current, the others had expired in 2004. Osvaldo's lawyer immediately claimed his client had no knowledge of these items. Someone must have planted them. But the box was covered in dust. It had been in that drawer for years, and the lock on the drawer used a key that only Osvaldo possessed, according to his secretary. Why would Osvaldo keep the licenses? Trophies? Insurance? Solis suspected the latter. If Benito had ever tried to talk, Osvaldo could have used the license to frame him for the murders, make it appear that Benito had kept trophies from his victims. A backup plan that had never been needed because Benito had stayed silent for 20 years. Osvaldo was arrested that afternoon. He sat in the interrogation room wearing his expensive shirt, now wrinkled, his lawyer beside him. Solis laid out the evidence. The photographs showing someone wearing his father's ring at the illegal logging site. The licenses of the missing researchers in his possession. The pattern of deaths among the logging crew. The suspicious cash transactions that had funded his business empire. Osvaldo said nothing for a long time. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. Finally, Osvaldo spoke. His voice was calm, controlled. He admitted to running illegal logging operations in 2004. The money had been too good to refuse. The forest was vast. A few trees here and there made no difference. Everyone was doing it. He had just been better organized. But he denied killing anyone. The researchers had seen something they should not have seen. That was unfortunate. But Osvaldo claimed he had not been at the site that day. Alejandro Ruiz had been in charge. Alejandro had panicked, made bad decisions. By the time Osvaldo had learned what happened, it was too late. The researchers were already dead. Alejandro had handled the disposal. Osvaldo had simply tried to contain the situation afterward. What about the deaths of the crew members? Coincidences, bad luck. These were men who lived dangerous lives, drinking, fighting, taking risks. Their deaths were unfortunate but unconnected. And the licenses in his desk? Alejandro had given them to him, proof that the situation had been handled. Osvaldo had kept them out of paranoia, evidence that could implicate Alejandro if necessary. He had forgotten they were even there after all these years. The story was convenient. Alejandro Ruiz, dead since 2005, served as the perfect scapegoat, unable to defend himself or contradict Osvaldo's version. But prosecutors found problems with the narrative. Phone records from 2004, archived by the telecommunications company, showed Osvaldo had received a call from Alejandro at 2:47 p.m. on January 14, 2004. The call had lasted 4 minutes. The cell tower data placed Osvaldo within 5 kilometers of the logging site during that call, not conclusive proof he was at the scene, but proof he had been nearby. More damaging was the testimony of Pedro Vasquez. Despite his fear, Pedro agreed to testify via video link from a secure location. He stated that while he had never met Osvaldo personally, he had heard Alejandro speaking to someone called Don Osvaldo on the radio that day. Alejandro had been asking for instructions. The voice on the radio had been calm, authoritative. It had said something about making sure there were no loose ends. Forensic accountants traced the money flows more carefully. The cash that had paid for Osvaldo's business expansion could be partially tracked to timber sales from wood that matched the species found in the Sierra Chinqua Reserve. The volume of wood sold exceeded what Osvaldo's legitimate operations could have produced. He had been selling illegally harvested timber through legitimate channels, mixing it with legal cuts to hide the source. The investigation expanded. Other employees from Osvaldo's companies were interviewed. Most claimed ignorance, but a few, granted immunity, began to talk. They described a culture of fear within the organization. People who asked questions faced accidents. One former accountant revealed that he had been told to create false invoices to launder money from illegal logging. When he had resisted, his car had been vandalized, his daughter had been followed home from school. He had complied after that. The medical examiner reviewed the autopsy reports from the 8 dead crew members.
In 3 cases, the original reports had been signed by the same doctor, Luis Herrera. Solis tracked down Herrera, now retired and living in Oaxaca. Herrera admitted that he had been paid to falsify certain details in the reports, to overlook evidence that suggested homicide rather than accident. He had been struggling with gambling debts at the time. The money had been irresistible. He provided bank records showing cash deposits matching dates shortly after each autopsy he had performed. But even with all this evidence, the bodies of Mateo Valdez and Isabela Navarro remained missing. Without bodies, prosecutors could only charge Osvaldo with conspiracy and obstruction. The murder charges required more concrete evidence. Solis organized a search of the mountains around the logging site. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, drone surveys of old mining shafts. The search took weeks. The forest was vast. 20 years of growth had changed the landscape. And there were dozens of vertical shafts from colonial-era silver mining. Each had to be examined. In late May 2024, a team rappelling into a shaft 17 kilometers from the logging site made a discovery.
At the bottom, 60 meters down, they found remains, scattered bones, fragments of clothing, a leather backpack with the initials EN carved into it, Isabela's grandfather's initials, her vintage camera bag, described by her family, though the leather had largely decomposed. DNA testing confirmed the identities. Mateo Valdez and Isabela Navarro had been found. The medical examiner determined that both had suffered fatal trauma consistent with a fall, or with being pushed. The shaft opening had been covered with branches and debris when the search team found it. Someone had tried to hide it. With the bodies recovered, the charges against Osvaldo were upgraded to murder. His trial was scheduled for September 2024. The case had become national news. Environmental groups demanded justice. Osvaldo's business empire crumbled as contracts were canceled and assets frozen. In June, Benito Hernandez died. His heart, weakened by the earlier attack and decades of guilt, finally stopped. He had given a full recorded confession from his hospital bed. It would be played at trial. His nephew Roberto said Benito had seemed at peace in his final days. The truth had been told.
The burden lifted. Pedro Vasquez entered witness protection. His family was relocated. New identities. He would testify at trial, but remotely. The fear remained. Even with Osvaldo in custody, Pedro believed there were others who might want him silenced. Osvaldo's wife filed for divorce. She claimed she had known nothing about his crimes. Their children distanced themselves. The family name, once respected, became synonymous with corruption and murder. As the trial date approached, more evidence emerged. A former sicario, arrested on unrelated charges, offered testimony in exchange for reduced sentences. He claimed Osvaldo had hired him to arrange 2 of the crew member deaths. He provided details that matched the evidence: dates, methods, payments. His testimony would corroborate the pattern of systematic elimination. The camera that had started everything was entered as evidence, Exhibit 1. Each photograph was analyzed and presented, the metadata verified, the chain of custody documented. Javier Castillo, the tourist who had found it, was brought from Spain to testify about the discovery.
He adjusted his glasses nervously as he described finding the waterproof bag in the tree hollow. Such a small moment that had uncovered such large crimes. The prosecution built their case methodically. The illegal logging operation, the discovery by the researchers, the panic, the murders, the cover-up. The elimination of witnesses. The rise of Osvaldo's empire built on blood money. They presented financial records, phone logs, testimony from survivors, and forensic evidence from the recovered bodies. The defense tried to maintain that Alejandro Ruiz had acted alone, that Osvaldo had been a successful businessman targeted by prosecutors looking for a scapegoat. They challenged the authenticity of some evidence, questioned the reliability of witnesses testifying about events from 20 years ago, suggested that the licenses found in Osvaldo's desk had been planted. But the weight of evidence was overwhelming, the pattern too clear, the coincidences too numerous to be anything but orchestrated. In the middle of the trial, another breakthrough came. A retired forest ranger named Esteban Morales came forward.
He had been too frightened to speak earlier, but seeing the trial coverage had given him courage. He testified that in February 2004, a month after the researchers disappeared, he had encountered Osvaldo and 3 other men near the shaft where the bodies were found. They had been carrying shovels and rope. When they saw Esteban, they had claimed to be conducting a geological survey, but their equipment was wrong for that work, and they had been nervous, aggressive. They had told him the area was dangerous, old shafts, unstable ground. He should avoid it. Esteban had understood the real message and stayed away, but he had marked the location on his personal map. That mark corresponded exactly with where the bodies were recovered. The trial continued through September and October. Each day brought new revelations. The scope of Osvaldo's crimes expanded beyond the murders: bribery, extortion, money laundering, environmental destruction. The illegal logging had stripped entire sections of the Monarch Butterfly Reserve. The ecological damage was estimated in millions of dollars. Thousands of acres of protected forest had been cut. The ecological impact would last generations.
Some days, the courtroom was packed with environmental activists. They held photographs of Mateo and Isabella, heroes who had died trying to protect the forest. Their sacrifice had meaning now. Justice was finally possible. Other days, the families of the dead crew members attended. They had lived with questions for years. Why had their fathers, brothers, husbands died in such suspicious circumstances? Now they knew. They had been eliminated to protect Osvaldo's secret, collateral damage in his rise to power. Pedro Vasquez testified via encrypted video link. His voice shook as he described that day in January 2004. The sudden appearance of the researchers, the panic among the crew, Alejandro's radio call to Don Osvaldo, the order to load the trucks and leave, the fear that had followed him for 20 years, the relief that came with finally telling the truth. The prosecution presented their final evidence in late October, a comprehensive timeline of events, financial records showing the flow of illegal money, the pattern of deaths among witnesses, the physical evidence linking Osvaldo to the scene, the recovered bodies of the victims, the testimony of survivors.
They painted a picture of a man who had chosen profit over human life, who had murdered to protect his illegal enterprise, who had then systematically eliminated anyone who could testify against him. The defense made their final arguments. They continued to blame Alejandro Ruiz, suggested that others in the organization might have acted without Osvaldo's knowledge, questioned whether 20-year-old evidence could be trusted, asked the jury to consider reasonable doubt. But doubt was increasingly unreasonable given the mountain of evidence. The verdict came on November 15, 2024. The courtroom was silent as the judge read each count. Murder in the first degree for Mateo Valdez, guilty. Murder in the first degree for Isabella Navarro, guilty. Conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of 8 crew members, guilty. The list continued. Environmental crimes, money laundering, bribery, obstruction of justice. 43 counts in total, guilty on all. Osvaldo Ramirez stood without expression as the verdicts were read. His expensive shirt was still pressed, but something in his posture had changed. The confidence was gone. His hand moved unconsciously to his right ring finger, where his father's gold signet ring had been before it was entered as evidence. The gesture was reflexive, a habit of 20 years. His fingers found only skin. The families of Mateo and Isabella embraced in the gallery. Mateo's mother, now 78, had waited 2 decades for this moment.
She clutched a photograph of her son at graduation, wearing his faded WWF cap, the one he always touched when nervous. The cap had never been recovered. Isabella's father held his daughter's compass medallion, returned to him after being found in Osvaldo's possession. The silver was tarnished but intact. He had plans to donate it to the environmental foundation established in his daughter's name. Inspector Ricardo Solis sat in the back row, rolling his peso coin between his fingers one final time before slipping it into his pocket. The case was closed, the longest investigation of his career. He opened his moleskin notebook and wrote the date, November 15th, 2024. Justice delayed, but not denied. The sentencing phase began immediately. Prosecutors pushed for the maximum penalty, life in prison without possibility of parole. They brought forward impact statements from the families. Isabella's sister described growing up in the shadow of an absence, never knowing what had happened, never able to properly grieve. The uncertainty had been its own form of torture. Roberto Hernandez, Benito's nephew, testified about his uncle's final years, the guilt that had eaten at him, the drinking, the nightmares where he would wake up calling out apologies to people who were not there. Roberto said his uncle had been a victim too, in a way, forced to live with knowledge that destroyed him slowly from within. The widows of the dead crew members spoke about raising children alone, about poverty that followed their husbands' deaths, about questions their children asked that they could never answer. Why did father die? Was it really an accident? Why did all his friends die too? Environmental scientists testified about the ecological damage. The monarch butterfly population that used the Sierra Chinqua Reserve had declined by 30% in the years following 2004. Some of that loss was directly attributable to the illegal logging. Entire groves of Oyamel firs, essential for the butterfly's survival, had been destroyed. The trees would take a century to regrow. Some damage was permanent. Osvaldo's defense team tried to mitigate. They brought character witnesses who testified about his charitable donations in recent years, his support for local schools, his employment of hundreds of workers in legitimate businesses. They argued for a sentence that would allow for possible rehabilitation. But Judge Carmen Mendoza was unmoved. In her sentencing statement, she spoke about the cascade of consequences from Osvaldo's actions. 2 young researchers murdered for doing their job, 8 men killed to cover up the initial crime, families destroyed, communities terrorized, an ecosystem damaged, trust in institutions eroded by corruption. The Butterfly Reserve, meant to be protected for future generations, plundered for profit. She sentenced Osvaldo Ramirez to life in prison without parole for the murders, plus an additional 127 years for the other charges, to be served consecutively, the maximum possible under Mexican law. Osvaldo would die in prison. There would be no early release, no second chance, no redemption. As guards prepared to lead Osvaldo away, he turned to look at the gallery. His eyes found Pedro Vasquez's wife, Carmen, who had attended in her husband's place. Pedro himself remained in protective custody, still too frightened to appear publicly. Osvaldo's stare was long and cold, a final attempt at intimidation. Carmen did not look away. After a moment, Osvaldo was led from the courtroom. The chains on his ankles rattled against the floor. The sound echoed in the silence that followed. Outside the courthouse, environmental groups had gathered. They held banners with photographs of Mateo and Isabella. Heroes of the forest, one sign read. Their truth survived, read another. When the guilty verdict was announced, someone released a cloud of paper butterflies into the air. Orange and black, like the monarchs that still migrated through Sierra Chinqua each winter, though in smaller numbers than before. The media coverage was extensive. The case became a symbol of delayed justice, of the power of evidence to survive even decades of suppression. The camera, hidden in a tree hollow, had waited 20 years to tell its story. The photographs Isabella had taken in her final moments had ultimately brought her killer to justice. In the weeks following the trial, more revelations emerged. Other businessmen connected to Osvaldo were investigated. The network of corruption that had protected the illegal logging extended into local government, police departments, and even some environmental agencies. A special prosecutor was appointed to pursue these connections. The camera had exposed not just one crime, but an entire system of criminality. The Sierra Chinqua Biosphere Reserve implemented new protections, increased range of patrols, satellite monitoring for illegal cutting, hidden cameras at vulnerable access points. The reserve became a model for environmental protection in Mexico. Tour guides now included the story of Mateo and Isabela in their presentations, how two researchers had given their lives to protect this forest, how their evidence had survived to ensure justice. Javier Castillo, the tourist who had found the camera, returned to Spain with a strange sense of purpose fulfilled. He had been in the right place, at the right moment.
His casual decision to photograph an owl's nest had uncovered a 2-decade-old crime. He continued his nature photography, but with a new awareness of the dangers faced by environmental defenders. He established a fund to support protection efforts in monarch butterfly reserves, naming it after Mateo and Isabela. Pedro Vasquez remained in witness protection. His testimony had been crucial, but the fear never fully left him. He knew there were others like Osvaldo, others who profited from environmental destruction, others who would kill to protect their interests. He lived now under an assumed name in an undisclosed location. His daughters grew up not knowing their real surname. The price of truth had been the loss of identity itself. The other conspirators faced their own trials. The corrupt police commander's estate was sued by the families. Though Enrique Salazar had died in 2019, evidence showed he had taken bribes to suppress the investigation. His assets were seized. The money went to a trust for environmental protection. The doctor who had falsified autopsy reports lost his medical license and served 3 years in prison. Others who had participated in the cover-up faced various charges and sentences. In December 2024, as the monarchs reached their peak numbers in the reserve, a memorial was unveiled. 2 bronze plaques at the entrance to the main trail. One for Mateo Valdez, biologist, protector of butterflies. One for Isabela Navarro, photographer, witness for the forest. The plaques included QR codes that linked to their research, ensuring their scientific work would continue to educate future generations. The camera itself went to the Museum of Natural History in Mexico City. It was displayed in a climate-controlled case alongside the photographs Isabela had taken. The final image, the sunset over the valley with the blurred finger in the corner, became iconic, a moment of beauty interrupted by violence, a last act of defiance, hiding evidence even as danger closed in. Ricardo Solis retired 6 months after the trial. The case had been his career's culmination. He gave the peso coin, his mentor's talisman, to a young investigator just starting in cold cases. He told her that sometimes evidence waits, sometimes justice takes decades, but truth has a way of surfacing.
Like a camera in a tree hollow, like bones at the bottom of a shaft, like witnesses finding courage after 20 years of fear. The monarch butterflies continued their migration. Each winter they returned to Sierra Chinqua, fewer in number but still magnificent. They clustered on the Yoyamal firs that remained, their wings creating that sound like whispers. Some tourists said they could hear voices in that sound, the voices of those who had died protecting this place. But that was just imagination. The butterflies knew nothing of human crimes or justice. They simply followed their ancient pattern, guided by instincts older than any human law. The forest began to recover. New growth filled the gaps where illegal cutting had occurred. It would take generations to fully heal, but the process had started. Seedlings pushed through the soil. Young trees reached for light. The ecosystem slowly rebuilt itself, resilient despite the damage done. In prison, Osvaldo Ramirez spent his days in a small cell. He had requested books about forestry, which authorities found ironic but allowed. He read about sustainable logging practices, about forest management,
about the delicate balance of ecosystems. Perhaps he was trying to understand what he had destroyed, or perhaps he was simply passing time. He gave no interviews, made no public statements. His empire had crumbled. His family had abandoned him. He had only his memories and regrets, though whether he felt the latter remained unknown. The families of Mateo and Isabela established a foundation for environmental protection. They used the settlement money from various lawsuits to fund research and conservation efforts. Young scientists received grants to study monarch migration. Photographers documented environmental crimes. The Foundation's logo was a butterfly perched on a camera lens, wings spread as if about to take flight. Local communities around the reserve began their own protection initiatives. They had seen what happened when outsiders came to exploit their forests. They organized patrols, established monitoring systems, created economic alternatives to logging. Tourism increased as the story of the murdered researchers became known. People came to see not just butterflies, but the place where heroes had died defending nature.
The investigation techniques used in the case became a model for other cold cases. The enhancement of old digital photographs, the tracking of financial records across decades, the patient reconstruction of events from fragmentary evidence. Law enforcement agencies studied the case. Academic papers were written about it. It became a textbook example of how modern technology could solve historical crimes. Some mysteries remained. The full extent of the illegal logging network was never completely mapped. Other businessmen and officials who might have been involved escaped prosecution due to lack of evidence. The market for illegal timber continued, though diminished. The systemic issues that allowed such crimes, poverty, corruption, weak environmental enforcement, persisted despite the high-profile conviction. Pedro Vasquez occasionally thought about his former life. The man he had been before that day in January 2004. A simple laborer trying to feed his family. The choices that had led him to that clearing in the forest. The moment when everything changed. He taught his daughters to respect nature, to understand that some things were worth protecting. He never told them why he felt so strongly about this. They attributed it to general environmental consciousness. They never knew their father was the last living witness to a crime that had changed Mexican environmental law. The story spread beyond Mexico. International environmental organizations cited the case in their advocacy. The image of the camera hidden in the tree became a symbol of evidence surviving against odds, of truth waiting to emerge, of justice delayed but ultimately delivered. It appeared on posters at climate protests, in documentaries about environmental defenders, in academic discussions about the real cost of illegal resource extraction. As 2024 turned to 2025, the reserve prepared for the next winter's migration. Rangers walked the trails, checking for signs of illegal activity. The new surveillance systems recorded every movement. The forest stood protected by technology and law in ways it had not been 20 years earlier. But everyone knew that protection required constant vigilance, that there would always be those willing to destroy nature for profit, that other Osvaldos existed, waiting for opportunities.
The butterflies would return, fewer each year, as climate change and habitat loss took their toll, but they would return. And when they did, their wings would carry the memory of all who had fought to protect them. The scientist who documented their patterns, the photographer who captured evidence with her final frames, the witnesses who finally found courage to speak, the inspector who never stopped investigating, the tourist who looked in a tree hollow at just the right moment. In the end, the case was about more than murder. It was about the price of environmental protection, about the courage required to document crimes against nature, about the patience needed for justice, about the power of evidence to survive attempts at suppression, about the interconnection between human crime and ecological destruction, about the long arc of investigation that can span decades before reaching resolution. The camera in the tree hollow had waited 20 years to tell its story. When it finally did, it spoke not just for two murdered researchers, but for a forest that could not speak for itself, for butterflies whose habitat was being destroyed, for communities terrorized into silence,
for future generations who deserved intact ecosystems. The photographs Isabela Navarro had taken in the last moments of her life became her testimony from beyond the grave. Her witness statement waited 2 decades to be heard, but when it was, it brought down an empire built on blood and ecological destruction.
Justice had been served. The case was closed. But in the Sierra Chinquara Reserve, the work continued. Every day, rangers walked the trails. Scientists monitored butterfly populations. Local communities protected their forest. And somewhere in a tree hollow or under a rock or in another hidden place, perhaps other evidence waited. Other stories needing to be told. Other truths waiting for their moment to surface. The forest kept its secrets until the right time, until someone was ready to listen, until justice was possible. The sound of millions of butterfly wings still filled the reserve each winter. That whisper-like rustling that had accompanied Mateo and Isabella on their final day. It continued unchanged, indifferent to human drama. The butterflies knew nothing of the violence that had occurred beneath their wings.
They simply followed their ancient migration, drawn by instincts encoded in genes, playing out a pattern millions of years in the making. They would continue long after the last witness died, long after the story was forgotten, long after the camera in the museum crumbled to dust. The forest would remember in its own way, through growth and renewal, through the endless cycle of seasons, through the eternal dance between preservation and destruction that defines all wild places touched by human ambition.